On February 23, 1945, inside a concrete bunker on Mount Suribachi, Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto scribbled words that would have been treasonous to his superiors. The Marines were not like other soldiers. What he had seen through a narrow firing slit contradicted every lecture, every assumption taught to him about American weakness. 6 Marines had assaulted his position beneath a storm of machine gun fire. 3 were struck down, but the others kept coming. When a grenade exploded among them, one Marine threw himself over the blast to shield his comrades and, grievously wounded, continued to fight until he could no longer hold his weapon. Within minutes, the position was taken. Yamamoto realized that Marine behavior on the battlefield did not fit the image Japanese training had prepared them for. And that realization, once spread from island to island, changed Japanese calculations about the Pacific War. That shift began much earlier, on August 7, 1942, at Guadalcanal. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, hardened by campaigns in China, recorded his surprise after a week of fighting. The Americans who had landed were unlike any enemy they had faced. They did not flee when encircled, they would not surrender, and they fought at night as if darkness empowered them. Where Japanese doctrine expected panicking, undisciplined troops, the Marines displayed steadiness and a willingness to take the fight deep into the jungle. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome led a company in a night attack on Henderson Field on August 20th. Trained for night offensives and confident of success, his 200 men walked into prepared American defenses. The Marines, hidden in carefully sighted positions, counterattacked into the darkness, firing with automatic weapons, taking the initiative instead of crumbling. By dawn, Fukudome's unit was devastated. American losses were tiny by comparison. For Japanese officers raised on the assumption that Americans were individualistic and unable to endure sustained hardship, the Marines' conduct was inexplicable. Survivor accounts and intercepted letters deepened this unease. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto, after months on Guadalcanal, described watching a Marine gunner continue to fire despite both legs shattered. A fellow Marine immediately took over and kept the weapon going. Such episodes convinced Japanese analysts that American training produced men willing to sacrifice themselves relentlessly for their units. Captured documents and post-battle reports made a stark point. The Marines had adopted an almost ritualized acceptance of casualty rates as a trade-off for achieving objectives. Where Japanese commanders believed in preserving lives unless success was guaranteed, Marine commanders were prepared to accept heavy losses to seize ground quickly. Tarawa, in November 1943, was an even harsher lesson. Rear Admiral Ki Shibasaki had 4,500 men in defenses he considered strong. The 2nd Marine Division shattered that belief in 3 days. Private Tadashi Ogawa, one of only 17 survivors, told interrogators about waves slaughtered in the surf and on the beaches, and about the thin, steady trickle of more assault troops replacing the dead. The Marines' willingness to sustain horrendous casualties until the atoll was taken reframed Japanese thinking. Marine operations were no longer isolated acts of bravery, but part of a larger system in which human losses were acceptable costs within a much larger industrial and logistical machine. By 1944, Japanese intelligence had begun to use consistent terms: shock troops, fanatical devotion, refusal to retreat. Captain Yoshio Kobayashi, who survived Guadalcanal, contrasted Army infantry, which he called conventional and prudent, with the Marines' aggressive, often seemingly irrational advance. Marine units accepted casualty ratios that would have stopped other armies and recklessly pressed forward to exploit momentum. The prolonged fight on Peleliu and the rapid capture of airfields in other islands made clear that Marines did not pause after heavy losses. They kept coming. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's defenses crumbled, not because his troops were poor fighters, but because they had planned against an enemy who would behave rationally. Pause after heavy losses, conserve forces. The Marines' disregard for such caution made previous defensive formulas obsolete.
This approach produced profound strategic consequences. Japanese commanders soon realized that the Marines were part of an attrition process Japan could not match. Marine units landed with overwhelming supporting firepower, naval bombardment, carrier and land airstrikes, armored support, and flamethrower tanks, and were backed by vast, reliable logistics. Second Lieutenant Toshio Yamamoto's nighttime patrol on Saipan found Marines eating hot meals, receiving regular ammunition resupply by truck, and rotating units out of the line for rest and medical treatment. Where Japanese defenders were fixed, short on supplies and unable to replace losses, Marines benefited from a steady inflow of men and material. Thus, as battles lengthened, the imbalance grew. Japanese casualties were permanent, American casualties were replaceable. The mathematics of industrial warfare, production, transport, and casualty replacement favored the United States. This reality haunted Japanese planning. A captured Tinian memo bluntly advised garrison commanders that against an American Marine assault, positions could not be held indefinitely. The objective became to delay and inflict maximum casualties to buy time elsewhere. Sacrifice became an explicit, grim strategy. Hold and die if necessary, because the cost imposed on the invader might affect broader strategic decisions. But the Marines' sustained offensive capacity rendered even high casualty counts less decisive than Japanese planners hoped. Inflicting 10,000 casualties on an invading corps might halt another force. On the Marines, it only slowed them briefly. That was the bitter lesson at places like Peleliu and Iwo Jima. The Americans could absorb losses on a scale Japan could not. Tactical observations underscored why this was so. Marines combined intense firepower with rapid, aggressive, small-unit tactics. What Japanese doctrine stressed, methodical preparation, reliance on banzai charges, and a cultural emphasis on death before dishonor, collided with a different American model: combined arms, relentless suppression, and an organizational readiness to accept sacrifice for swift gains. Raiders and specialized infantry showed how night operations, infiltration, and quiet, precise attacks could create disproportionate effects. Colonel Kono Ichiki's night assault on Guadalcanal in August 1942 was turned into a massacre in 20 minutes by Marine raiders firing at point-blank range. These tactics, later folded into general Marine doctrine, created a 24-hour pressure on defenders, day and night attacks, constant artillery and aerial harassment, and no safe time to rest.
Historical diaries and interrogations captured this psychological shock. Soldiers who once believed the Americans would break under pressure saw instead an opponent who kept advancing amid devastation. They watched beaches covered in bodies, watched waves of attackers replaced as quickly as they were slaughtered. They experienced the industrial application of force: hills erased by naval gunfire, positions burnt